With rings on their fingers and bells on their toes, it's Richard, Paul and Giles with their guest Tim Burrows. So fill up your glasses and join in the song. The four of us are ready and it might take quite long. So come, podcast listeners, and take up our tune. Let's discuss a town called Mercy and the Last Chance Saloon. And many more.
So hello, and welcome to the podcast where we take something old, that's a Doctor Who story from the original series, compare it with something new, one from the new series, add something borrowed, that ballad, to make something Who. Yes, it's Something Who podcast, episode 42. I'm Richard, and we're back with another look at a pair of Doctor Who stories, this time with a Western theme. First up is another First Doctor story, it's The Gunfighters, and then we'll look at 11th Doctor outing a town called Mercy. And with me to mull over these homages to Western films are Big Finish writer and Missing Episodes podcaster Paul. Hi, Paul.
Good evening, Richard.
Yeah. We have astronomy and astrophysics author and occasional TV quiz show let's get this right. Occasional TV quiz show contestant Giles. Hello, Giles.
Hello, Richard. Episode 42 already.
Yeah.
Life's the universe and everything, eh?
It's amazing how quickly that comes round.
Why stop now just when I'm hating it?
Yeah, absolutely. And to finish off our quartet, we have a real treat. Coming back to something Who, by popular demand, and because Gav wasn't available...
His, you mean?
It's former Grumpcaster and the other half of the Missing Episodes podcast, Tim.
Hooray!
Hooray!
Good evening. Can I apologise to your listeners for not being Gavin? Where is Gavin? Is he just busy, or is there some sort of pending inquiry which he is suspended until it's resolved, or something like that? I think he's just busy, is he? Or is he on holiday?
He did give me an excuse for not being able to turn up this time. Something about the dog eating his homework, I think.
Oh, right. And he just doesn't like the Gunfighters.
There is that.
He's the other one.
Because we've already, as an avid listener, I'm already aware that Gavin doesn't like fun. And doesn't like historicals. Sorry, Gavin.
So, we'll kick off, I guess. We'll kick off by having a look at The Gunfighters. Written by Donald Cotton. We haven't looked at a Donald Cotton one before. Directed by Rex Tucker, who, of course, was going to direct the first one and finally got round to doing one in season 3. I mean, obviously, if there's one thing that we all knew about the Gunfighters growing up, or at least in the early 80s, sorry, that's a bit before your time, Tim, it's that it was the nadir of Doctor Who. We were told that on good authority. It had very low viewing figures. Actually, when you look, in fact, they weren't as low as all that, and they got far worse later on in this series, and then also at the start of season 4. But audience appreciation was very low. Apparently it was only 30% for episode 4, whatever 30% meant. Commissioned by John Wiles and Donald Tosh, but actually realised by Lloyd and Davis. Who wants to kick us off then with the Gunfighters?
Well, shall I take up from there? Because
Yeah.
I think that's an important axis of this story.
Mm-hmm.
Because legend has it that, as you say, Wiles and Tosh commissioned it, and Innes Lloyd and Jerry Davis had already decided that they didn't like historicals and they didn't like comedies, or they didn't like that style of comedy. And so when you're watching The Mythmakers, it feels a little bit like a game of two halves, doesn't it? In that it feels to me, I mean, Paul's much better on this writing style stuff, but it feels to me that you've got a truer version of Cotton's Doctor Who in the first 2 episodes, and then it feels more like it loses its way as the rewriting gets heavier as it goes on, because I think I'm right in saying that Cotton wrote a witty script per the Mythmakers, and they had various nervous moments when they were making it, and I think they all sat down and watched the 57 gunfights at the OK Corral and decided it needed more action, and then they decided it was too dry, so then they started ad-libbing a bunch of comedy in it. Like, is it Phineas with the stutter and
Oh,
so
yes.
on, and Stevens?
That's an ad-lib, is it? That
Yeah.
Oh dear.
No writer writes a stutter.
Stevens comedy, which is very gamely done. So yeah, it feels like a bit of a mixed bag, but I really enjoy it. And the reason I really enjoy it is because I can block out almost everything and just concentrate on William Hartnell having a whale of a time and showing he's got timing, and I don't want to say the word chops, but he's got comedy chops. And you just feel him relaxed in what he's doing and enjoying it. And I think he enjoys Cotton's version of the Doctor as well. And Cotton's version of the Doctor is crotchety, yes, eccentric, yes, but he's always got no self-awareness, hasn't he? So in the Mythmakers, he finds himself as a victim of other people's machinations and is always trying to get out of it, and it's the same here. There's a case of mistaken identity, which is a Western, or it's both a Western cliche and a Cotton, I don't want to say the word trope,
Well, don't then.
so I'm going to say cliche again. A real lack of self-awareness, like right at the start when Stephen's in his dandy cowboy outfit and the Doctor says, "Why don't you wear inconspicuous clothing like I do?" And Hartnell's just really enjoying himself.
Yeah.
And that's a pleasure to see, because it's at this stage in his Doctor Who career, and indeed his acting career, where he's struggling. So to see him just really getting to grips with some light-hearted comedy and showing off some great comedy timing, that is the main thing for me. Sorry, I've covered a load of stuff there, or skimmed the surface of.
You said everything I would have wanted to say, so that's excellent. I'll just go and have a bath.
So, a town called Mercy.
I'm glad you did some research. I always rely on at least one of you having read the book. That's one thing I ran out of time to do this time, read up on any production issues. So this business of rewrites, interestingly, you pinpointed the second half of the story. I mean, is that just your observation? Because I spotted that as well.
Yes, it is.
And what I was going to say was, I was going to spend most of my time comparing it to the Mythmakers, because they are the yin and yang of Doctor Who historical black comedies, aren't they? They're the two supreme and in some sense the only examples we've got. But Mythmakers feels to me like it keeps the comedy level up pretty consistently into episode 4 and then does the switcheroo.
Yeah.
And I always remember thinking that the Gunfighters does the same, and that's Cotton's thing. And when I was trying to pitch my own version of a Cotton historical for Big Finish, that was going to be my secret sauce. It's episode 4 where people won't be expecting this. It suddenly goes dark. They didn't go for it. But this time, as you say, the comedy starts to fade out in episode 3, and it's never been an exact match, has it? Because although, in a sense, they're two historical events where we know there's going to be a massacre in the last 5 minutes, and that's what it's building towards, they don't handle that in the same way, do they?
No.
So it's interesting to think that it could have been a result of rewriting, because I think Donald probably would have stuck to the same structure more closely, because, from my point of view, he perfected it in the Mythmakers, and I think it's too early to try to start playing it straight in part 3. So, good call.
Yeah, it does feel that perhaps they might have lost their nerve and just started to go for a sort of straight western halfway through or something.
The other thing I was going to say about comparing it with Mythmakers, I suppose the other difference is that it's got the pastiche western going on there.
Yeah.
So it's not just a historical; it's also pastiching a fictional genre.
Yeah.
Whereas Mythmakers cuts out the middleman. I think that's what makes it so extraordinary, and why it will always just edge Gunfighters out for me. It's both taking history (brackets myth) close brackets, and it's doing history, but in the style of a sitcom or something. It's not pastiching other versions of Greek history we've seen. It's not doing it in Shakespearean style, for example. There's no attempt to get comedy out of using Shakespearean language. It just modernises the language for the most part. Whereas here we do have the 3 levels going on: the real history somewhere in the background, but more prominently the Western cliches, brackets, tropes.
I guess because westerns have obviously been a much more, in terms of cinematic history, westerns are a much more influential genre than sword and sandal.
At this point, I don't suppose anyone's ever really tried to do a western without, tell an historical story set in that era, that place and time, without also pastiching the western tropes. And without getting ahead of myself, by the time we get to a town called Mercy, that's no longer the case. But I'll just leave that one dangling.
I think to Richard, to your point where you said, well, they sort of gave up halfway on the witty stuff and started thinking we'd better do a western. That's actually what happened, I think. And I was reading some Pixley about it in preparation, and he said at one point, sort of Davis handed it over nervously and said, this isn't very good, or this isn't working. And that's when and then they just sort of made light on it. And he also commented that they were laughing themselves at how bad their accents were. So they just sort of went with it. So it just becomes this mishmash in the second half. And Cotton's vision is trampled out.
The other thing I didn't have time to do fully was read the book, but I did read enough of it this afternoon to spot that there are a lot more jokes in it. Right. And I thought the thought briefly flickered through the mind that it might have been, some of them might have been jokes in the original script. I think that's unlikely. I very much doubt that Cotton had an original script to look, with jokes with Jerry Davis's red pen through them that he could refer to and put back in, that had been burning to address the balance knife for 20 years. I think he probably just saw the opportunity for new jokes as he was writing the books. It's what you do. You look at your dialogue and you think, well, that could be better. That could gag this up a bit. But anyway, yeah. If anyone is at all disappointed in the gag rate of the finished version, just switch to the book. It's terrific.
In the book, he has Hartnell in the gunfight, doesn't he? Sort of comedically, clumsily discharging the shotgun and taking out one or two of them, I think.
Which is set up right from the beginning of the book as well.
Yeah, that's right.
And yes, he does. It's interesting. He does take the opportunity to fiddle with the plot a bit. Yeah. I mean, not none of the big structural points, but.
So that's Chekhov's shotgun, then, is it?
Isn't the book is written is Doc Holliday's like deathbed confession, isn't it? Yes, yeah.
Told to yet another voice, which a character is not in it, but that's just, I suppose.
Oh, right, okay.
Maybe that's pastiche in the 19th century novel way of doing things. You have to, the more layers, the better. It doesn't quite reach Frankenstein proportions, but.
And I don't want to labour the point about the Cotton, Davis, Tucker split on this, but I think there's a fingerprint in the music as well. And indeed, in the book, Cotton's verses are the ones which are the scene-setting verses. And Rex Tucker decided, presumably having viewed Gunfight at the OK Corral, to take the narrative trick of whoever's singing in that film to describe what is happening on screen. But Cotton's verses are the scene-setting ones, so with rings on their fingers and bells on their toes, and ends up talking about prostitutes and so on. And that's very Donald Cotton and witty and, layered, whereas the really boring, repetitive ones about Charlie the barman and all that sort of stuff is Rex Tucker. I started really disliking Rex Tucker, both watching this and reading about this.
Interesting. Yeah.
I think there's a definite split. It's just a shame we can't see what Cotton's original vision is.
It's funny, by all accounts, the regular cast didn't get on with Tucker either. They felt like they were being left floundering, supposedly, at least according to the production notes. Tucker was somewhat out of his depth and elected to concentrate on the guest actors, some of whom he'd cast in previous productions, and left the regulars feeling a bit out of their depth. And yet Tucker then had his name taken off he's not uncredited for episode 4. He wanted his name taken off the credits.
Strange that, isn't it?
Supposedly due to disagreements over the editing of the actual gunfight film material, at least according to the production notes.
I'd have disagreed as well. No, it's strange to think of Rex Tucker, who's this giant figure in, he's one of the founding inverted commas fathers of the show, isn't he? And it's quite sad when you see him come in that he's had such an unhappy experience. both in terms of his output and literally being so unhappy he takes his name off it.
But he does have time to give his daughter a walk-on part, apparently.
What?
Oh yes, yeah.
Yeah. So apparently his daughter is Jane from Rod, Jane and Freddie, and she turned.
Oh, that was my fact.
Brilliant.
And she's somewhere in the lynch mob, isn't she? Or the
Just next to Bungle. It's easy to spot once
You
you
see,
know.
Jane had a genius for comedy. I remember an episode of Rainbow where she's walking around the house, for the entire 10 minutes of the episode, and she can't find her sunglasses. And in fact, the whole time they are perched atop of her head.
Right.
So she didn't get the comedy gene from Rex, did she?
Clearly not.
I was just about to ask you what precisely it was you didn't like about Rex's direction, but I think you've just given me a clue, because I thought it was technically quite proficient, but that's because we've been thinking quite a lot about Richard Martin recently, so anything seems like an improvement. But are you saying you don't think he was sympathetic to the tone of this piece?
I don't
get
like
the
the
best.
fact that they all sat down and watched the 1956 film and threw out Cotton's version and put their own on it, and then sort of gave up on it, took their names off it,
Right.
and made it into a bit of just a free-for-all, really.
Without knowing anything of the problems, the fracas behind the scenes, I would have assumed he did a quite good job bringing it to screen, just from the textual evidence. That's interesting. Maybe it could have been even better.
I think from a technical direction point of view, I think it is good, and it's kind of, because this comes straight after the arc, doesn't it? Which is another one where you actually see them. Okay, they're doing some surprisingly ambitious shots
It's
here,
Toymaker,
or stuff that
isn't
you
it?
wouldn't. Yeah.
Are they not wearing?
They
they're
bought
wearing
Oh,
clothes
sorry,
from
no, it
Toymaker,
is the
I think.
toy maker. Of course, you're right. Yeah.
They just bought a ladder that they can stand one of the cameras on. That's all they've done.
Are there any other? I can't think of any other stories that have lots of shots from up a tower.
Yeah.
No, straight down looking on the action. I don't know if that's forced by the smallness of the sets, or it doesn't seem like a particularly Western thing to do.
No.
Well, they got an extra
It's-
camera in for episode 1. They had 6 cameras,
Ooh.
Right.
including the apparently, which was exceptional. And they obviously they were
I'd have had 7.
they were pushed for space and stuff, because of some of the things that they apparently the no shooting sign in the bar is actually, that's concealing a window that they could lift up to put a camera behind it and shoot into the
Interesting.
set. They were trying to squeeze so much onto the studio floor.
Is this the sort of thing Tucker's famous for?
I think Tucker was sort of caretaker producer until they found Verity Lambert.
Right.
And I think he was sort of caretaker director until they found Waris Hussein.
Right.
So he was edging both aspects of the production forwards until they got the permanent. He was a placeholder until they got the permanent people selected, and he made various choices in storytelling as well. Oh, things like I imagine he changed the names of the cast from whatever Barbara was going to be called to
Lola, Cliff and Lola.
that sort of thing. I think he was at that sort of level with it, but always a placeholder. Oh no, I tell a lie. Was he going to direct alternately with Waris Hussein? Anyway, he was definitely a directorial sort of influence.
He was an unsafe pair of hands.
I do actually think that overhead shot is only partially successful. It's a bit showy, and I liked it the first time. But then there are loads of other scenes where he's doing it for no reason. It's not actually adding to the drama. It just makes you think, what? Is somebody stood at the top of the stairs? Are we supposed to be identifying with somebody spying on them? And he's just doing it because he's got a camera stuck up there, and he wants to get his money's worth. So, but there are plenty of other places where I thought.
And it works for the Doc Holliday shot in the bar, especially, doesn't it? But then that's the whole perspective, and it was a rare case, to my mind, of I suddenly thought, oh, hang on, they've lost the focus on this shot, and I was thinking, no, there is actual depth of field in this shot, which is a very rare thing for 1960s Doctor Who, to my mind.
Well, I'm not going to try and talk about depth of
studio
field
stuff, but
in 1960s Doctor Who studios because I did that for an aborted pilot for a different podcast.
oh,
Talking
okay.
Talking about the chase. And I shared up the limitations of my understanding of lenses and focal lengths.
Right.
Yeah, don't worry. Can we talk about anamorphic widescreen now? Having covered ourselves in glory in a previous incarnation.
Yeah.
I watched Gunfight at the OK Corral, the movie, to familiarise myself with it, or re-familiarise myself. And yeah, obviously Tim is quite familiar with it anyway, by the sounds of it. I don't think it can be as simple as them having had a panic and then decided, what do we do? Let's rip the movie version off, because there's so much structurally that is there and that is that is wrong about the 57, the movie, and is and the wrongness is inherited in this. And there are also things like the ripping off of the ballad, and the first shot is effectively
the same, isn't it? Yeah.
Is exactly the same. The entire setup, it's actually slightly different characters, because the movie takes a possibly more historically accurate way around it, and the TV series basically makes the Clantons the Clanton gang the focus from the start, whereas in the movie there are various others. It's Ed Bailey, I think, who is the one that's looking for Doc to avenge a killing, to avenge a shooting at the start. I think, and there's stuff like the inclusion of Johnny Ringo, who historically was never anywhere near the OK Corral, and yet is written into both of these treatments. I think basically because he was a rival of Doc. He was Doc Holliday's bitter rival.
I don't think is Bat Masterson in the movie. I don't think he is he?
I think he briefly turns up.
Is he?
Yeah,
he's a major part in Cotton's version, and he was nowhere near Tombstone at the time of the fight. So it's quite interesting. And Pixley also pointed out that Cotton actually paid someone to research the history.
Right. Okay.
And then threw that out.
And then threw it out.
Going down the line of a much simplified. Well,
I was going to say, who was it? Peter Haining.
Oh, nice one. Yeah, so he ends up doing a simplified version of the film, it looks like, but the structure is very much the same, isn't it? With Doc Holliday in hiding, and then it's maybe he just found that a nice excuse to get the Doctor involved, in that Holliday's in hiding, and therefore he can do the mistaken identity thing. I don't know. But when they sat and watched the film for vibes, I definitely get the sense that they stripped a different kind of use of the song and more action, which ends up in that mess of a fight at the end. Because in the film, it's a long fight, isn't it? It's a long old fight.
Yeah.
There's a wagon that catches on fire and so on, and they try to copy that in the TV show. But the actual gunfight was 30 shots in 30 seconds or something, wasn't it? It was they were meters apart.
Yes.
They were lined up, and it was hell for leather, and it was chaos, and no one could see a thing, and there was smoke everywhere, and no one knows what happens. All of one side say they fired first, and all of the other side say they fired first.
Yes.
The cast of characters at the actual gunfight was different. Wyatt Earp was second to Virgil.
Virgil was,
and the whole modern myth of Wyatt Earp has grown out of a largely fictional biography that was written after he died. I mean,
and it didn't even happen at the OK Corral, but Gunfight at CS Fly's photographic studio presumably wouldn't have been so catchy.
So yeah, Cotton has made a conscious decision to discard the actual history because he researched it in favour of doing a, shall we say, homage to the film, or a pastiche of the film, which was then further diluted by the evil Rex Tucker and his minions.
Can I assume that it wasn't Cotton's idea to write about the gunfight at the OK Corral in the first place then? Was he asked to write this?
I think it was
he
Wiles and
pitched
Tosh. I think the production notes imply it was Wiles and Tosh who came up with the idea of, well, let's do a Western.
Well, explain why his heart doesn't seem to be quite as much in it as it was with the Mythmakers, and why he would research one way of doing it and then think, that's not going to work. I mean, it's not. You feel like with the Mythmakers, he knew how he was going to approach it from beginning. Even though I think last time I discussed it, we discovered that it wasn't actually his idea either, was it?
It's not going to be the last time in Doctor Who, though, is it, that the history is somewhat inaccurate and they go for something very broad. And I think, to some extent, it's kind of irrelevant that the history is all wrong. And I guess we see more of this in A Town Called Mercy. The point of the last couple of episodes seems to be about this kind of dilemma that they've got. Masterson wants to go with the law, but in the end, retribution seems to win the day.
Is Doctor Who allowed to do that? Is Doctor Who allowed to spoof and parody? Because everyone here present today probably has a different take to the chap I've replaced, who, when he's listening to this, he will be gurning and foam will be coming from his nostrils and mouth, steam from his ears. And I don't care. I think it's that wonderful.
You've conjured me out of my time, Eddie.
Good lord.
Can you play in a William Hartnell pling plong pling noise?
So this is my replacement.
My visage can appear. Yeah, a Dandiana clown. Tell me something. What is The Gunfighters? It is not a historical story.
No.
Stop calling it that.
It isn't.
If they travelled back in time, if the TARDIS landed in World War II, and they were in Germany, and there was a bloke called Brian Hitler, and his right-hand man was Winston Churchill, and nobody commented on it.
Yeah.
They were just like, "Oh, we're in the Second World War. This is fun." Why is this? Why are they not in the OK Corral having the same reaction as when they see bloody Zeppelins in the sky in Alternate Earth in the Cyberman thing in the new series? Why are they not going, "Oh, but these he's not supposed to be here. This isn't how history's meant to be."
Steven's from the future and Dodo's an idiot.
Because they've only seen the movie, they don't know the...
Yeah, well, exactly. So you've got Stephen and Dodo. Stephen's from the far future, and Dodo probably hasn't watched very much westerns. So
he hasn't finished school.
And the Doctor's a bit kind of out of it by this stage. So maybe they just haven't noticed. But I mean, isn't it just as likely though that basically the Celestial Toymaker is sending them through another game or something? I mean, or at least
that is the only explanation.
Or at least it's like the Master of the Land of Fiction. Yes, they're not really ended up in Tombstone. They've ended up somewhere else.
You can say that again. I mean, the weird thing is, some of the decisions are so arbitrary because you've got people like Bat Masterson, as you said, he wasn't in Tombstone. He was somewhere else at the time. He was vaguely connected to these people, but he wasn't there. But you've got Wyatt Earp's been made town marshal in the Doctor Who version. When it was his brother Virgil, he was the actual town marshal. So they've just arbitrarily swapped them. And I appreciate this is because this Wyatt Earp biography from the 30s.
Yeah, and because it was Burt Lancaster in the movie.
Yeah. So, but if you know anything about these events, it is the most surreal experience watching this thing that appears to be, the TARDIS has gone back in history. Oh, but they're different. Oh, there was no Reuben Clanton. Oh, there was no Seth Harper. Pa Clanton's supposed to be dead. There is no Phineas Clanton. Hang on, Ike Clanton wasn't killed in the... It's so weird. It's like watching a Titanic movie and the Titanic doesn't sink at the end. And you're just thinking, why is this called Titanic? What is going on here?
Yeah.
This is insane. And the weird thing is like, it's just like you were saying about the Mythmakers. But I'm reliably informed that if you've got a doctorate in history, some of the Mythmakers is funny because it's not how it was meant to be. So apparently, if you watch the Mythmakers and you're up to your eyeballs in the reality of it, quote unquote reality, you go, "Oh, that character's supposed to be a tremendous personality and a courageous bloke, but in this he's a simpering idiot." So that's allegedly hilarious. But if you're a normal person, you're just watching it thinking, "Who's this simpering idiot?" And then you have to have Tim and Toby Haydock explain to you later why it's funny. But you're like watching the Gunfighters, having an out-of-body experience, thinking, is this some just astonishing parody of the genre, or just
the Western
subverting...
is a modern myth.
Yeah.
Well, yes, but
That's my case.
it's not like a myth where you have gods and Trojan horses and you just make stuff up and that becomes a myth. It's not a fictional story to begin with that has become embellished. It's a series of people who were murdered and now their deaths are apparently just fair game. Or just murder people who didn't die at the time. Just bring Johnny Ringo in and have him die in a different place, in a different part of the country. It's mental.
Or bring Sid James in as the Rumpo kid. Why not?
It's mental.
We're losing him. Is somebody fiddled with controls? We're losing Gav. He's
You
going all wibbly.
You wish. You wish. And the weird thing is, the whole point of the gunfight, both the catalyst and both the political background and the reason the actual fight took place are both perfectly clear and sensible and didn't need changing, and yet they are changed because it was basically the city folk versus the country folk, and the Clantons were the country folk, and the Earps didn't like them and they didn't like each other. But it's so weird that the story is re-centralised around Doc Holliday, and the Clantons' whole vendetta is against Doc Holliday, who, you know, he was a background character and he was a temporary policeman in reality, whereas in the Doctor Who that he's one of the Earps is like, oh, I'm not going to fight with him, he's an outlaw. You made him a bloody policeman in real life, you idiot. Anyway.
But again, he's Kirk Douglas in the movie. That's
well,
why.
this is the other thing.
That's why he's your main. Yeah, that's why those are your two go-to
This is why
guys.
it's interesting. Watching from the ether, as I was eavesdropping on your universe from my time, Eddie, it was fascinating to discover that, like with the Mythmakers, apparently this is not as terrible if you've watched 17 other things that this references. So, again, if you've done your homework, this isn't as bad as you think it is. That is the take-home that I have learnt from the Gunfighters. So
It's good if you've watched too much other television and film, and it's bad if you've read too much history. So I think we know where Doctor Who's aimed, what its audience is.
my time Eddie's destabilising.
Oh dear.
I'm fading away. I'm fading.
So I think
what's a
going
bridge
back to the
for, eh?
question
Bye.
is Doctor Who allowed to pastiche genres and not be slavishly loyal to history? I think Gav's a no.
That's the problem with Gav on a podcast. He just doesn't really make it clear what he thinks. He's always so equivocal.
I like to think that Cotton's vision was poking fun at an entire generation of people that had grown up watching Western films every Saturday at the cinema and having a laugh at them. Is Doctor Who allowed to do it, though? Gav says no.
I mean, you're right, Tim. I mean, you can't really overstate how much the Western was a thing in this era. I mean, of course, this is before I was born, but very shortly afterwards, my dad
1881. That's before you were born. You mean
1966 was before I was born. But very shortly afterwards, I'm there with my dad and my granddad every Saturday afternoon watching, I don't know, the High Chaparral or any number of other Western series. And so, yeah, I mean, it's absolutely something that people who watched Doctor Who in 1966 would be really very familiar with, in a way that when we watch it now, it's dropped out of the scene.
Well, it's interesting because it's also when this was made. I mean, OK Corral is very much of the, given that it's got a sonorous song to it and everything like that, and it's of that kind of classic Western tradition. Yeah. And then it's kind of, but by the time this is made, this is around the time that you start getting the real revisionist ones.
Yeah.
Coming in the 60s, and I guess associated with like counterculture in Vietnam and everything like that. That these things, so people start looking at it through a different lens at that point. Anyway, so maybe it's just again, it's this kind of critical mass of these horse opera type, very classic Westerns has built up, and people start questioning it. And in some ways, maybe this is questioning it in a different way from Sam Peckinpah or Sergio Leone, for instance.
Yeah, for 2 episodes.
Yes. And then they decide they better go down. Yeah.
Can I talk a little bit more about it as Doctor Who, rather than as history or pastiche or anything? I'm going to call back to something from about 3 hours ago. But Tim pointed out that the Cotton Doctor, which I heartily agree with. One thing that's obvious about the Cotton Doctor, he's quite passive, isn't he? As well as being a bit of an idiot savant, he also seems to bumble through these events, barely aware of what's going on. But luckily they pulled back from having him, accidentally bump into the villains and push them over a cliff or whatever. But he slightly fixes that in the novel. Again, the thing you mentioned, that bringing him into the climax in an active way. Do you think there's any way in which Cotton recognised coming back to the script afresh that he was a bit too passive, his hero? If it didn't bother him in 1966, why would it have bothered him in 1986? There's a question for you. You don't know.
We don't know whether in Cotton's original version that Hartnell was in the fight.
That's true.
I don't know.
But it's a very tricky, as subjects go, and yes, it's one of the most famous incidents of the Old West. So from that point of view, you could understand zeroing in on it. But given that the whole thing is focused on bloodletting, and you can't, the myth makers, okay, we know it ends bloodily, but there's a lot more local colour along the way, as it were. Whereas this is really, the actual, the historical background, as we say, is just a petty feud that ends in a lot of bloodletting. It's a very difficult story to land the TARDIS crew into. It seems.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that if I was saying, okay, let's do a Western. I mean, okay, you're taking some gunplay and stuff like that for granted, but you'd think, is this actually the story that you'd want to do? And then does that dictate that the Doctor has to have a passive role? Because what else, and the idea of the Doctor kind of prattling around with a shotgun in the midst of an actual gunfight, it probably works in the novelisation when it's filtered through 2-3 layers of narration, but actually seen representationally on screen, if that was actually shown in a way that it was undeniable, that you had to then represent that was the Doctor doing that, having some active role in gunning people down, then would that be going too far? So perhaps you had to have this thing of him, and it's an interesting conceit anyway, that you just drop the Doctor into the middle, and the Doctor's arrival starts to muck things up. I don't think it can miraculously raise Park Lantern from the grave and explain why there were 2 other Earpsor Lanterns, or whichever ones we're missing.
Doesn't feel like this is a fixed point in time, does it?
Have we been here before? I mean, as we've driven into the ground, there are so many difficult decisions you have to make when you're writing a historical Who in any era, then or now. Can they change things or can't they? If they can, do you go down the route of getting a gag out of Doctor Who creating history? Or do you get a gag out of him trying to avoid changing anything? Or do you shirk away from either of those extremes and just have him watching from the sidelines, which is usually quite unsatisfactory, but you can get away with it in a comedy? I think here this is probably, compared to, say, the Mythmakers or the Romans, probably the story in which the Doctor is most passive. Because there are no gags about creating wooden horses, or there's no starting the Great Fire of London or setting off Vesuvius. There's not even any great tension as to whether or not they'll negatively affect recorded history. They're just there and they're watching.
Well, Dodo, however, is directly responsible for Johnny Ringo's death.
Yes, yeah.
I thought Dodo was quite good here. I was going to say that I think it's probably, without having seen too often, it's probably her best story as a character, and probably as a performance, which I guess she's doing the best. It's still not great, but
she does stick to her own accent, unlike Peter Purves. I mean, Peter Purves is very game.
She's perky, and she's watching what Purves is doing, and they're both trying to grab the comedy, wring every bit of potential they can out of the comedy. I don't imagine she would have thought of doing that if she hadn't been working with Bill and Purves.
She gets smacked on the bottom an awful lot.
Yes, there is that. I thought with Peter, I mean, the legend of Peter Purves.
I hadn't spotted that. Cancel it. I'm off.
So the legend of this story is that Peter Purves doesn't like it, but I mean, it seems like, not unlike the Morton Dill character in The Chase, he's actually going for it quite well. He does some nice double takes. He sort of deliberately stumbles over stuff in places. he's given it an awful lot to say that in the end maybe he didn't enjoy it all that much.
Does he still say that? It's interesting. No, it's a very fine line, because he manages to give a funny performance while not breaking the number one rule of Stephen as a character, which is that he's not funny and has no sense of humour. But here he's funny because of that.
Yeah, that's true.
So good.
And at the encouragement of the evil Rex Tucker to try and rescue the production, just go for it, guys. And to a young game actor like Stephen, he can do all the tricks, can't he? He gets his singing out. He switches accents at will.
Yeah.
He's got all of his comedy trips and all of that.
Yeah, but you say there's one too many.
I think he might be just showing off a little bit. Hartnell, though, I mean, I'd love to think that Hartnell. There's one bit with Hartnell which I'd never really noticed before. Charlie the barman is over the bar dead for about 2 episodes. But but there's a lovely bit that I hadn't really picked up on before, where Hartnell goes to lean on him and then does a double take.
Yeah.
And that was just it was just nice.
Now I think he's also
I missed that.
at the top of his game, and it's easy to miss because it's such an understated performance. But he doesn't bollocks anything up in the way he does in the Romans.
Yeah.
Yes, he's not chuckly.
But that's the difference, isn't it? That's Cotton's Doctor, where he's the not the victim but the bystander. Whereas in the Romans, he's being forced to be the funny man rather than the straight man, and that's where the Romans falls down.
He can only be chuckly if he understands what's going on, because it's when he's explaining things, and it's when he's being forced to be the Doctor in that, and especially the early 60s children's TV Doctor, and he has to explain things, and he's tweaking his companion's cheeks and giggling. But
I like that version too.
well, of course. No, it stands out almost as much as the Christopher H. Bid-made Fifth Doctor. Really, he's so different in those stories by that one writer. It's almost like I can't think of many other examples of a single writer who writes the Doctor so.
Yeah, there's a nice moment with when Hartnell is with Jackie Lane, and they're both drinking milk in the bar.
Yeah.
It's sort of reminiscent, I suppose, of Doctor and Vicky maybe in the Crusade or something like that, or in the Romans where they're.
It's one of a couple of contradictions that sneak in, isn't it? I never touch alcohol. Well, apart from in the massacre in the Daleks' master plan, in the Time Meddler, and so on.
Yeah.
And then there's I assume it's a Donald Cotton touch where Stephen's playing around with the gun at the start, and he says, "Be careful with that. That's from my finest collection," or something like that, doesn't he? And so this maniac has no aspirin in the TARDIS, but a collection of guns, and then spends the rest of the 100 minutes pretending that he hates guns. He's got a bloody collection of them.
Yeah.
So there's some slapdash story editing going on there. I would blame Rex Tucker, but I can't. I've blamed him for enough, so I think that's Jerry Davis's fault.
Blame Jerry Davis.
Yeah.
You can say that one.
We've all very magnanimously not talked about one problematic aspect of this production. All very carefully strayed away from it, as if... Is it too lowbrow to discuss the accents on this podcast?
Nothing's too lowbrow for this podcast.
I should have made more precise notes. Again, one of the things I always remember about the story is that the actors with the best accents get killed off earlier on, leaving them the worst to stagger on for all 4 episodes.
Yeah.
But it's not quite as simple as that, but there's an element of it, isn't there? So what I find baffling about the general standard, I think, is okay, but the few bad ones are so bad that they're so distracting. They're not bad in the way that American accents can be. A foreign accent is normally bad. They're just bizarre. It's like they're being delivered by people who've never heard an American accent. It's not the sort of accent you would expect from somebody who knows what an American accent is but can't quite get there. It's really like it's being described to them by some other medium. It's astonishing.
Yeah.
A series of pictograms.
Yeah.
Ike is clearly the worst, and he's got, like Paul says, the most lines, and it bounces from Australian to Cockney to I just don't know. It's just this.
I don't get it because all these
Scooby-Doo
actors have
villain.
grown up watching American cinema. What excuse have they got? They were as immersed in American culture as we are.
But at least
Probably more so.
William Hurndall is consistently awful. You know what you're getting with him after a while, and you can sort of get by because it's consistent. But the others dip in and out. I thought Lawrence Payne was awful. So Johnny Ringo,
Yeah.
Yeah.
which is a
Is this
shame
a-
because he's very charismatic and handsome
Yeah.
in the role, isn't he? And menacing, and he's all over the place.
Is there supposed to be anything going on in his accent, like a shade of, I don't know, something Latin or Mexican? Is there? I just wonder because of the surname, if
Italian
perhaps
at
he
one
was
point.
trying to
Yeah,
put a bit
but
of.
I mean, the excitement about
Mexican.
this is I mean, this is probably somebody else's hidden fact. But they wanted to cast Patrick Troughton. Can you in that role? Apparently, can you imagine what his accent would have been?
Well, Philip Maddock was somewhere in the vicinity, wasn't he?
Yes,
at
yeah.
one point. And the biggest ball drop is in that what should be a lovely film sequence at the end, the gunfight, the crowning glory of the serial. And I think it's Billy. I can't remember the actor's name. But he interrupts. Well, it kind of needs an interruption because I'm not a fan of that film sequence at the end at all. But he suddenly screams out because his accent is all over the place. But
Yeah.
he suddenly screams out. Forgive my impression, but something like, "I'm gonna go get Doc Holliday," and it's just a shame, isn't it? It's just a shame. But I knew it was coming, so it didn't detract from my overall enjoyment of it, which I said at the top. I do enjoy it, but it's one of the main reasons I would never show this to someone else.
In this fantasy place that purports to be the OK Corral and Tombstone, Arizona, it's also that's how they speak there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is it talking of just reflecting on better performances? And I've got a lot of time for it, and I think John Alderson's quite good as Earp. Is quite, although apparently on that one we missed having Donald Sutherland was considered for the part, but Alderson apparently had actual Western experience. He'd been he'd spent part of his career in America doing actual westerns. I think he's fun.
He is, yeah.
Anthony Jacobs is great.
Yeah. He's a bit old, isn't he, for the part?
Yes, yeah. It's funny they always Doc Holliday died at 36, and the
Right.
thing I was going to say about the death, the thing I was going to say about the deathbed was that I by accident have ended up having a drink in the very hotel where Doc Holliday died.
Oh.
In Glenwood Springs, Colorado.
Ah.
I was on holiday a few years ago and driving between Denver and Salt Lake City and stopped off in this town and we just stopped off for a coffee and a drink and found ourselves and there was a sign saying Doc Holliday died upstairs. Yeah,
Right.
but not until he dictated the gunfight.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, he's not as old as you think, though. Anthony Jacobs only apparently 46 when he made this.
God.
So he certainly looks older than that.
Yes,
in
yeah.
The film, I would say.
That's really old, guys.
He's
And
just,
of course,
just a
really
young
old.
fella.
Yeah.
And of course, Kirk Douglas looks fairly similar in the movie
Yeah.
version as well, which is interesting because that in the movie version you can see where they kind of maybe that's where he picked it up from that the opening scenes with Kirk Douglas as Doc Holliday, he is quite genial and dapper and has that same thing, and then he gets a lot worse and harsher as the movie progresses. But you can see where they took the tone.
Tuberculosis is completely omitted in the Gunfighters, is it?
Pretty sure, yes, yeah. No mention of it.
That's a strange omission. You'd think they'd put that in as a little historical nugget. I would have thought they would.
Yeah.
It just detracts from Doc Holliday's
You say
character.
that's
of
the
it.
one historical fact
Oh,
you
he's
think is
he's back.
critical.
The Time Lords have boosted the power.
I don't.
That is
no,
the
I'm
one
not saying
historical omission that broke.
No, I think it would have been a nice bit of character flavour. That's it.
Yes, yeah.
Who's that guy? Oh, it's Gavin.
It's the Edge, isn't it? From U2.
Does William Hartnell just shout the words "dilly dally" as he appears on the screen? I've never understood that. It just sounds like he appears on the monitor in The Three Doctors, and he's just shouting "Hello, dilly dally." I have no idea what's going on there. I thought about doing that myself, but I didn't know if that's what was really going on, so I omitted it.
In The Three Doctors, what?
Yeah.
Doesn't matter, Tim.
It's-
Going back to the gunfighters, can I just make... I've calmed down now, but
Yeah.
can I make a small observational point? It's a shame that the history was thrown in the bin, because the actual, if you want to call it an arc story, within this little narrative of Ike Clanton is far better and more interesting. I don't know about any of the 13 films that this is homage to, but in real life, there'd been a stagecoach robbery. And Wyatt Earp was trying to find out who'd done the stagecoach robbery, and he thought Ike Clanton's friends had done it. So he was trying to get Ike Clanton to throw them under the stage. And he was trying to bribe Ike. He was going to give him like $6,000 or something reward money to name the friends who'd done this robbery.
Uh-huh.
Anyway, the word ended up getting out that Ike was considering selling out his friends, and Doc Holliday was talking about it. So Ike confronted Doc Holliday and said, "I believe you're going around talking about the fact that I'm a traitor." So it set up this interesting thing where Ike was paranoid that he was being let down by people he knew, and there wasn't this necessary simmering tension with Doc. The interesting thing then was that in the 48 hours up to the gunfight, Ike was getting wound up. There was a big poker game between the Earps and the Clantons and the real lawman, who's not included in the gunfights at all. There was a critical player in all of this, and they were all having a poker game. They all drank all night, played poker, and got drunk. And Ike was getting increasingly wound up. And Ike was then going around town spoiling for a fight with the Earps and saying, I'm going to kill an Earp, find me an Earp to kill, or worse to that effect. And he was just trying to get into this big thing. And then when the gunfight finally kicked off, Ike panicked and said to Wyatt Earp, "I haven't got a gun, don't shoot me," and he legged it. And I think that's a beautiful series of character developments, that this guy was paranoid, developed into bravado, and then bottled it at the last minute, and he let his friends and relatives be gunned down. And I think that's more interesting. I think Ike being a coward and legging it after being the instigator of the famous gunfight at the OK Corral is more interesting. And if I was writing this, I would go with that. Whether
it would have appealed to Cotton, wouldn't you?
And instead he's just
He likes deconstructing the ideas of heroes and
killed.
villains.
Yeah. So that's my little thought on Ike Clanton. I think truth is far more interesting than this just everyone dies randomly version that we get. And Warren Earp didn't die at any point, not in the gunfight, but he didn't get shot in a prison cell either. He died in California some years later. He was just nothing to do with it.
And didn't Ike then try to, well, not sue, but have the Earps?
Yeah, there was a big
prosecuted
thing about who
the
done
murder.
what and who was right to do it, and I think the Earps were cleared. But yeah, it was far from goodies and baddies.
Even in the two 90s films, they still persist with... I mean, they have the luxury of researchers, and, you know, they do go to pains to get some things right, but they still mix up the historical events in order to tell a more Hollywood story with a climax at the gunfight.
Yeah.
I think two of the brothers were shot. Well, in I can't remember which one, Tombstone or Wyatt Earp. In both of them, I think Morgan Earp gets killed before the gunfight, and he doesn't. He just wasn't shot at all before the gunfight.
He was wounded in the gunfight and survived it in real life.
Sure.
And then was killed afterwards? In
Yeah, I
revenge?
think so.
Yeah.
But even by the 90s, where you think they've got the time and the storytelling skill to make it into a more historically accurate thing, they still persist with not doing that. So it's curious.
Print the legend, eh?
You don't get in this, though, that kind of entirely that goodies and baddies. I mean, even though it's completely historically inaccurate, the Earps are shown to be, not entirely in the right, and the Clantons aren't completely in the wrong. And certainly Doc Holliday's an ambiguous character in the sort of Fagin sense. He's a lovable rogue rather than a nasty piece of work. But yeah, it's not quite a goodies versus baddies in a classic Doctor Who kind of a way.
He's a lovable rogue who kills an off-screen character
Indeed, yeah.
for a plate of beef.
Yeah, quite.
Doc Holliday, I think in real life, was one of the few people that had any kind of particular reputation. He'd thought to have killed at least 3 people, but a lot of the Earps, they were not well known as gunmen. I mean, the Earps, that's in it. Like you were saying, it's not a black and white thing, but the Doctor Who could have played more on that, because the Earps were, I mean, yes, they were lawmen, but they were pimps and they were saloon owners. And there's a lot to explore in the factual side of things, and I get that sometimes writers want to embellish stuff because the truth isn't interesting enough, or they want to tell a particular story. But the thing I struggle with in the Gunfighters is that it doesn't sacrifice truth in favour of anything better. The truth in many respects is more interesting, and the grey areas of right and wrong is a really fruitful topic to explore. And you could write a whole thing, and you probably tell me it's been done, where the Earps are quite clearly the bad guys, and the Clantons were the friendly locals protecting their ranch, and they were there first. They'd been there a long time, and the Earps came along and they were lawmen, but they were looking after their own interests, and they were businessmen as well. So that they exercised the law how it suited them, and you could very easily spin a story where the Clantons are the goodies and the Earps are the antagonists, and just winding them up the whole way through, because they were doing things like needlessly enforcing trivial rules to wind the Clantons up. There was I think an incident where one of the Clantons' horses stepped foot on the pavement, and that was in violation of a bylaw or something like that. So one of the Earps said, that horse is ridden where it's not allowed to ride. So they needled him, and like an hour.
Series of microaggressions.
Yeah. I think it was about an hour before the gunfight, Morgan had found Ike and pistol whipped him. So it wasn't like the gunfight was the first time they'd converged on this location to settle their beef. It was a general day of antagonism following a night of drinking, poker playing, and needling each other. They'd been to court. He'd been dragged to court an hour before the gunfight. And Ike was spoiling for a fight, and so was Wyatt Earp, and Wyatt Earp thrust his gun in his face and said, "Here's your gun. We'll settle it right here." The only reason it's not the gunfight in the courtroom in Tombstone is because the judge walked in and they settled it in a slightly more respectable manner. Otherwise, the shootout would have been an hour or two earlier in the courtroom, and history would have been very slightly different. But so my frustration is when history is a perfectly acceptable and interesting story to tell, and someone somewhere along the line doesn't care. That bugs me.
Do you know what? That normally bugs me in almost every historical drama I watch, but somehow not in Doctor Who, and I don't know why. I should feel very ashamed at making an exception on no grounds whatsoever.
Shall we talk about a study in terror? Because there's a few things I could tell you about the Whitechapel murders.
I think that's an edit, Richard.
I'll take my special hat off then.
It's funny, I have. That's like my similar thing with regard to science in Doctor Who. I'm quite happy. I'm usually quite happy to to hand wave and just think, oh, it's Doctor Who, and I give it a free pass. But the thing that pushes my buttons is when I can see that there's something really good, or just a an opportunity to do something that is cool and accurate, or just or just a little bit of pseudoscience that could explain something away in a better way, and yet the ball is dropped.
Yeah.
I'm the only person who's ventured an opinion as to whether I enjoyed it or not.
Oh, good lord!
Apart from Gavin.
Yeah, I always thoroughly enjoy it, and I think it's still think it's pretty neatly constructed. It's interesting what you were saying about the way the humour drains away rather more rapidly than it does in the Mythmakers, for instance,
and not necessarily replaced with anything, anything else. But
Yeah.
no, I think it's terrific. And if the Mythmakers didn't exist as for me to compare it to, then it might be. Oh, might be no, forget it. I wouldn't call it a historical story. I once listened to a podcast where they were trying to list all the historical stories in order, and I completely skipped the gunfighters because people just don't think. It was one I was on. I was hoping to get a rise out of Tim there. But that did happen, didn't it?
It did happen.
Yeah.
A few times.
And maybe that's telling. Maybe it's because deep down we knew that we should be ashamed of it, ashamed of labelling it with the H word. We knew that Gavin, who we hadn't met at that point, would one day soundly berate us. Anyway, I also think that Mr. Werp is very funny. It's one of the silliest running gags.
Oh yes.
Mr. Werp.
Yeah. I mean, I watched it in two halves, and I think I enjoyed the first half more than the second half. But yeah, I mean, I thought it was a good and entertaining piece. I'd certainly. I mean, I've already watched it more than most Doctor Who. That's probably about my fourth viewing of it, but I'd be happy to give it a fifth.
Why is that? Why have you been subjected to it so many more times than, say, many much better thought of stories that you've apparently never gone back to?
Well, most of the stories I've never gone back to are in the new series, which I watched the Gunfighters the first time, I suppose, on UK Gold. I've watched it with my daughter. Probably watched it when I got the DVD, and then this would be the fourth time. So yeah, I mean,
fair enough.
What did your daughter make of it?
Well, she didn't. I can't remember her being either particularly overjoyed or disappointed with it. She kind of watched them largely in sort of silence and maybe asked a few questions here and there. I think probably she
in a hostage situation.
Yeah, indeed, yeah. I think she enjoyed other ones probably a bit more, but she didn't sort of run out of the room or anything.
I just enjoy watching it because I enjoy watching these ones where you feel Hartnell is firing on all cylinders.
My get at is that I watch Doctor Who for Doctor Who, and that's why I forgive it more, whether it's doing science or history or whatever the hell it's doing. I forgive it more because if it's good Doctor Who, and this is good Doctor Who, and it gives the regulars lots to do. And if anyone thinks it's too silly, I also watched a bit of Karen Cowboy for no particular, because I was in the mood.
Yeah.
And there they call Wyatt Earp Mr. Twerp.
Oh right.
No.
It could be worse. It makes the running gag about Mr. Werp seem Chaucerian.
It makes you wonder whether Hartnell nicked that directly, because it precedes the Gunfighters, and Hartnell probably kept an eye on the Carry On films, I dare say. Don't know. It's possible.
I missed where it came in. I was going to say that I think it's quite delightful that, because I do love anyone who's got the balls to keep a running gag, a silly gag going way past the point where most people would lose confidence in it. But I was thinking it was just a bit of absurdism, Mr. Werp. But does he read it on a sign somewhere, W. Earp?
Oh, I see.
I just wondered if perhaps there was a reason for it that I hadn't seen.
No, I don't think so.
No, it's just something he starts saying for no particular reason. That's good. I prefer that. I would have been disappointed if it turned out that it was just based on phonetics.
Yeah, and you're kind of relieved to hear it's not a fluff and it's a deliberate joke, because it's in that grey William Hartnell area of diction, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it is deliberate.
So, I mean, are we getting close to the end of our discussion of the Gunfighters. Are there other things that people wanted to say about this?
Oh, apparently, in fantasy casting stuff, apparently Carol Cleveland was possibly up to play.
Oh,
All right.
Doc Holliday.
To play Kate. Yes.
Oh, right.
Or considered to play Kate.
Right.
Which is she's quite a Carol Cleveland kind of a character anyway.
Yeah.
Which would be, So we can imagine a version with Pat Troughton
Yeah.
as Johnny Ringo, which
Yeah.
begs the question of what would they have done 6 months later when they were, or less when they were casting a Doctor.
Yeah. And if
Would they
only,
have bothered to come up with an entire season-long arc to explain why the new Doctor looked like Johnny Ringo?
and if only David Graham and Shane Rimmer had been playing their Thunderbirds counterparts.
Yes. Does Shane Rimmer read the audiobook?
Possibly.
Yep. I know. It just leaves me wishing that feeling there should have been a trilogy of Donald Cotton stories. I mean, it wouldn't have been a trilogy. I just wanted a third one. But
you get that in the targets, don't you?
Yeah.
You do, yes. Yeah.
And they're all told through the eyes of others, so it's quite a nice little set. That I think.
what's a lovely positive note to end on. Quick, move on
before Gavin comes
Yeah.
back.
Okay, so the second one we're looking at is A Town Called Mercy, written by Toby Whithouse. So one of the writers we've looked at a few times on this podcast, and directed by Saul Metzstein, who also directed The Crimson Horror. So we've talked about one of his before.
Oh,
quite
right.
recently.
There you go.
Last time you also did Metzstein, and you've had at least a month to work out which it is,
Yeah.
Richard.
And I said a name to conjure
Yeah, yeah.
with, and then completely forgot tonight that we'd already.
That's right. Well, let's call the whole thing off, eh? Yeah. So what do we know about this? It's filmed in Spain, where the spaghetti westerns. Why are they spaghetti westerns if they're in Spain? Shouldn't they be
Italian producers,
I see.
Italian owners.
right? It also received very high appreciation ratings. So much as Gunfighters was the least appreciated in the classic series. Apparently, this was the most appreciated story of the 5 that it appeared with in that little mini series. In
Was it
2012.
really? How interesting.
Series 7A, isn't it?
Yeah. So, anyone want to venture a thought about A Town Called Mercy?
I hadn't watched it since Transmission. It's the classic,
Yeah.
classic opening gambit here. Yes, I did enjoy it. I found some things a bit distracting. Just thinking about, I'm feeling like it pastiches westerns and things like that, but it's the western setting kind of incidental to the story here, rather than it doesn't feel terribly integral
Yeah.
to it. I guess there's a few bits that touch on it. They touch on the idea that it's a few years. It's only been a few years since the Civil War, and I suppose that slightly is mirrored with.
Yeah.
But Carla Jax, is that his name?
Jax.
Well, Jax, yeah, with his backstory.
Captain Jack.
Showers Jack.
Sharon's Jack, yes. Sharon who? But it sort of feels like there's a kind of, well, obviously it is a kind of morality play sort of thing.
Yeah.
It raises some interesting questions, but it doesn't feel like the Western setting was necessarily the only one in which they could have addressed that.
No.
So it doesn't feel quite so much of a Western, despite having little nods to it, like the Undertaker constantly measuring up Matt Smith's shoulders, and
I think it's
What
more
does
window
that
dressing and the occasional gag, isn't it? Here, rather than.
yeah.
And fundamentally, it's not doing a pastiche in the way that
No.
the Gunfighters is.
It's interesting that you both say that, because the brief was write a western with
Yeah.
a robot.
That was the basic. Yeah.
The comfort that the writer finds is just putting in all the window dressing and then writing a different story. But that was an interruption.
Yeah, I think we've got 2 stories here where the writer has been told write a western, and they both approach it in different ways. Neither of them thought, "Oh, goody! I've been waiting all my career to do this."
Yeah.
But they both went about the task in different ways. Cotton fell back on what he already knew about westerns, and possibly took the lazy approach of just pastiching one particular story, but doing it in his style. Whereas here it's a triumph of style over substance, the Gunfighters. Whereas here, I would say Toby Whithouse has chosen to write a story he's interested in.
Yeah.
He's gone down the science fiction route, the morality, the moral dilemma route,
Yeah.
and I guess he started thinking about the tropes, the cliches, the iconography of the Western, and he's made a short list on a bit of paper, and before he's got to the end of the page, that's enough to fire off a particular story in his head, and then from that point on, he's concentrating on this story he's telling, which is why, as you say, it's not really anchored in that world. He does it well enough that you don't feel that it's gratuitous or or superfluous. The setting, it's just a nice balance of the two. But it does fundamentally. I was going to get into a bigger discussion of the way in which historicals differ in New and Old Who. Have we had that before?
Well, I mean, we had two of them
Of course.
last time, but I don't know that we had.
Yeah, I still haven't formed a firm conclusion. But of course, we don't have the pure historicals now that we had back then. But we've I don't know. Maybe we've also touched on the fact that is there any such thing as a pure historical? It's this label that we
Yeah.
brought up to believe. It just meant there was no science in it. But it's a story where the history is all completely wrong, and it might as well be set in an alternative universe. Is that really a pure historical any more than if it turned out that the Clantons were a
Robots,
load of drive-ins in disguise?
It feels very much to me like a companion piece to the God Complex. You've got this kind of creature that's out there waiting. Now, of course, in the God Complex, it's looking for devotion, and in this one, it's more about coming back for vengeance. But you've got that. I don't think it's quite as good a story as the God Complex, but it just seemed to me that it had that kind of similar sense of the lurking presence out there.
That's very nice. Which came first, the God Complex?
Yes, it did.
Was God Complex season 6?
Yes.
I think
series 6.
He's definitely very good at blending those different requirements. A good science fiction idea, a strong dramatic theme, and the superficial layer, which is probably anything left from the brief, whether it be have a monitor or set it in a hotel. Perhaps there wasn't a brief on the Goblet Complex, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
You always get the feeling that the one-line brief, the slutty one-liner that Moffat gives to all his writers, is much less evident. It's never the first and foremost in the Toby Whithouse story. It's always just hanging in there, fighting with whatever he actually ended up being most interested about.
It's quite a religious story in the broadest sense of being religious in that it addresses questions and things that are usually regarded as the province of religion or faith or spirituality, isn't it? I think all these questions about mercy and forgiveness and culpability, and it works pretty well. I mean, there's a couple of points where it's I felt like it's maybe put a little bit too much on the nose in the dialogue. I think there's one bit where Adrian Scarborough, who's generally fantastic, but I think there's one bit where he more or less spells out the Doctor's dilemma to him. Yeah, and I slightly winced.
It's interesting because you've got Isaac, the marshal, and he's prepared to forgive Jex, but then he hasn't actually suffered the consequences. So to some extent, it's a lot easier for him to say, "Well, can we not just forgive this guy? He's done really great stuff here." Whereas I guess the gunslinger, who is the guy who has suffered the consequences, it's a much harder dilemma for him to turn around and say, "Oh, it's all okay then. You've turned over a new leaf."
To my cynical eyes, I mean the character, what's he called again? the original marshal.
Isaac.
He seems too good to be true. I mean, he's very big on forgiveness, and he's got a lot of faith as well, as you say.
Yeah. No, it is true.
But I wasn't looking at it from a religious angle. I was just thinking, this guy's too good to be true. That seems a bit contrived. He's acting in the way that the plot needs him to, so that all the pieces can be in their position at the end and tell a very neat, and admittedly very neat conclusion, a very satisfying conclusion. But I did think that his accidental self-sacrifice seemed a bit too contrived for me. But if I actually consider what sort of man he was supposed to be, which I didn't, and that's my failing, I wouldn't have had anywhere near as much of a problem with that. Oh, you made me think, Richard. I don't like it. Don't do it again. The moral dilemma stories are never my favourite type of Doctor Who because, as you know, they make me think, and I don't like that. It's uncomfortable. No, that's not the reason. The reason they're not my favourites is because they're very difficult to do well, and this is done very well. This is done as well as they ever are in 45 minutes. But I've just seen too many bad ones which raise much bigger issues than you can do in the length, or than the writer is capable of doing, or possibly even than Doctor Who as a format is capable of doing. I just remember early on, way back in the first series, forming that opinion. Dalek deals very well with the moral dilemma for the Doctor, but then Russell repeats that same idea in Boomtown, and it never quite worked for me because, well, I mean, I won't go into all the reasons there because we're not discussing that one, and we probably will one day. But I just seemed partly that the ideas were too big for that episode, and partly it's a problem when you take a moral dilemma that makes sense on a human level and put it in a science fiction context where the Doctor has choices that we don't. But the dilemma he's facing is something that the human writers thought up and that we will identify with. But you just think, well, this is all very true. But this is true for us on planet Earth, but it wouldn't necessarily be the truth of the Doctor. He can get out of this. The same in the same way that the vague abilities of this future science can often scupper stories that are based on the unhuman science.
You put your finger on something there, that the stories, they have to be the right size to fit, to do that sort of thing. But this feels like it is the right size, the right size for the format. In that you're dealing with one, you are dealing with essentially two characters. It's not like they're not.
It's a character study, isn't it?
And,
really?
it's an aftermath story. You're not pitching everything into the middle of the war and expecting us to process all of that stuff and a moral dilemma in 45 minutes.
I'll happily admit that I'm still unsure whether the reasons I'm not 100% sold on it, as much as I enjoyed it as a piece of Doctor Who, are because I missed something. But being presented with this guest character, what's his name? Kaiser Soze?
Carla Jax?
Carla Jax.
They're all Carla something or other. Yeah.
Right. So, Toby has decided to tell a story about a man the Doctor meets who sort of breaks his calm, his reserve, his non-violent, his antipathy to retribution. Brings out the worst in him. We haven't really seen him like this since, well, the Daleks tend to bring it out of him, but since possibly, the episode Dalek. And I think, what's so bad about this man that brings that side of the Doctor out? Isn't this too big an idea to be told through these characters? And that had me bothered. Then I thought for a minute that the story was going down the path that the reason the Doctor reacted so harshly was not because Carla Jax was the most evil foe he'd come up against in decades, but because he reminded him of himself. Because he'd made the same decisions to end a war, and the utilitarian decision. But then that sort of was left unsaid. So now I'm not sure if that was in my head, or if Toby was being subtle and not spelling it out. So what do you think? What have I missed?
No, I thought the same thing and made a note. Sorry, we seem to be monopolising this slightly, but I kind of made a note, and I made a thinking mistake that I was thinking, this is foreshadowing the Day of the Doctor, and then I thought, well, hang on, is it really foreshadowing the Day of the Doctor? Because I forgot that it's season, all of the stuff comes after season 7B, so it's about a year away at this point. It's not like coming up in the next couple of episodes.
It feels like it's foreshadowing it if you've already seen it. But for the Moffat and Toby to have got together and written this story with that in mind, seems a bit ambitious with that long gap.
Yes.
But of course, while the audience at the time would not have seen Day of the Doctor, they would have seen Dalek and Last of the Time Lords and The End of Time and all the other stories that make it perfectly clear that the Doctor is still suffering, not in any danger of getting over.
Yeah, I didn't feel it was too big a reach that this guy pushed the Doctor's buttons.
So it was just subtle writing. That's
no, but it's spelled out as well, isn't it? That we're saying the question of whether he's overreacting is addressed by Amy Pond.
Yeah.
This is what happens when you travel by yourself, which was a terrific moment for me.
Right. Yeah.
Mm.
And in brackets, the only thing that either of the Ponds had to do in the entire episode. So I thought it was fine. I quite liked the tip from Matt Smith being astonishingly good at physical comedy. You know, that I'm a sucker for that business with the cocktail stick and the attitude he shows when he's readmitted into town, and you know he like squares up to all the residents, and you see that comedy side very quickly flipping to him seeing innocent beings being tortured and killed, and it makes him angry, and I'm okay with that, and I like all the moral dilemma stuff. I too felt it not a deliberate foreshadowing, but Moffat might have nicked that sort of dilemma for the Day of the Doctor. Don't know.
Yeah. Yep, that's more likely, isn't it? That it brought it back to his mind.
Yeah. What I didn't like was what I felt was a cop-out ending. I didn't like the suicide. I thought that was incredibly convenient for all concerned, and I didn't feel it was very true to the Sharaz Jack.
Yeah, particularly given that 10 minutes earlier he'd said how worried he was about facing death with the weight of all those souls.
Yes. Yeah, and absolutely. And I just felt it wasn't quite a right ending. It was just a convenient way of hitting an end button on the story.
But at least you got Chekhov's self-destruct mechanism.
I think that does link into what I was trying to say about these stories that raise massive moral dilemmas that possibly can't be answered. It's not so much that the story ran out of time to answer it, but that it's a connected point. It's a dilemma that if the Doctor is not going to be able to answer this question, don't raise it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah,
I was thinking, I don't like this trope: the Doctor encouraging the bad guy to commit suicide to avoid him having to make a decision on how to deal with him. But I couldn't actually think of any examples. I feel like it is something that I've seen elsewhere. I couldn't think of examples. Can you think of any? The suicide absolving the Doctor of responsibility.
Of having to make a decision.
Literally that, not metaphorically, but
yeah. I can't off the top of my head, but I agree. I feel like it's something I've seen.
We'll edit some in.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, one does come back to when you mentioned Boomtown before, and now that does it. And we're not here to discuss Boomtown, but to my mind, that does it in the most that gets out of it in the most ballsy way you possibly can with a literal Deus Ex Machina, and it is I think it's a masterpiece, but it's something you can absolutely only do once, and it is the writer, and that is the equivalent of the writer throwing their hands up and saying, this is the entire point, that it kind of takes a Deus Ex Machina to solve this.
I think what I'm trying to say is, I realise why I'm confusing myself. I've many times seen a character sacrifice himself to save the Doctor from a sticky situation or a decision. And this is just that pushed turned up to 11, isn't it?
In terms of the Western side of things, one could almost call it Doctor Who: The Three Shanes, because you've got the Western Shane about the gunslinger who comes in to kind of save the day and sort of tackle the local nasties, and to some extent you've got Jex, who's come in and sort of helped them with the electricity, and he's cured the outbreak of cholera. So in the same way that Shane sort of comes and chops down the tree, I mean, he doesn't want to be the gunslinger, he just happens to have been that, but he comes in and helps practically around the farm, and then in the end he's kind of pushed into helping them to fight off the baddies. And then you've got Matt Smith is the second Shane, because he's sort of coming in and mediating, I suppose, in the situation between Jex and the gunslinger. And then at the end, when they're all leaving, then the gunslinger stays around, and he's Shane as well, because he's around to kind of deal with any nasties who come along afterwards. So, I mean, to my mind, that anyway, that was the closest that I could think of that this sort of fitted into a Western story that I'd come across.
Well, I shy away from using such words, but I just can't think of any other one because I'm just thinking about avoiding the word. But it's very, very tropey having a, slightly oddball character come into town who ends up taking up a sheriff's badge and saving the day. It's just what westerns are. Every single western that's ever been made is some quirky character coming in and saving the day. Where this one goes very different is it ends up trying to mash the boys from Brazil, or Joseph Mengele and Nazi war crimes and all of that sort of stuff. I don't think that's a marriage that's been done before. And sorry to go back to it, but it sets up the dilemma quite nicely and just ends it quite dissatisfactorily. And the suicide, no one's bothered by it. People are relieved by it. The writer's relieved by it. The doctor's relieved by it. And then it's just a bit of a letdown if you overthink it. There are a few bits that I pick holes in as well. It's a complete and utter nonsense that the gunslinger has to stay outside town because he's frightened of hurting innocents in town. This is a town roughly the size of Canterbury, by the look of it. And the thought that they've got 81 residents, that's fine. They've had cholera. But is this guy so incompetent that he can't get the right guy? He can't pick him out, he can't fling him out. That didn't work, but it didn't really matter. It was just a bit of storytelling. Oh, I was about to go on a Moffat rant, but should I do that now?
Well, up to you.
I really don't like the thing with a thing with the Moffat era that he does time and time again is have a contrived bit of narrator at the start or at the end, or a contrived bit of mythos at the start and at the end, and I really dislike it. I really dislike that. But that was the only Moffat-y thing I disliked in it, because my memory of the time was feeling mightily relieved with Series 7A, in that Series 6 and 5 were really bogged down in arc and timey-wimey stuff. And Series 7A, Dinosaurs on a Spaceship, it was Asylum of the Daleks at first. The first one, was that right?
Asylum was first, yeah.
They're all standalone stories, so it felt very, very refreshing to me being able to sit down for 45 minutes and watch start to end a story. And for that reason, I enjoyed it at the time. And I enjoyed it not for that reason, because I'd forgotten the pain of trying to figure out what the hell was going on. But I just enjoyed it as a really well-made, gorgeous-looking standalone story. And that's my sort of memory of it, and what carried forward yesterday when I watched it. It's really competently made, entertaining. Love all the Western stuff. Love it. If you're going to do a Western, have him riding a horse, have him wearing a Stetson, have a lynch mob, have a gunfight. I just think it does everything it's supposed to do, and is a good example of what Doctor Who should be.
Yeah, I mean, you do actually get horses in both stories. I mean, I was I was kind of surprised to see horses in the Gunfighters. I mean, I know it's Ealing, so it's just about doable. But I thought that I was surprised they were able to do that somehow. I mean, I know it's no elephant, but it's still quite impressive.
You don't have to take up in the lift, do you, to the fourth floor?
So just remind me, after the Gunslinger, what was next? After A Town Called
Power
3.
Right, okay.
And then
And
Angels Take Manhattan.
And then the Angels.
So it's on a downward spiral after this, I'm afraid.
Yeah. And again, it's so long since I watched it, but that thing with Amy calling out the Doctor about this is what happens if you travel alone. And at the end of the previous episode, we've just had, which was Dinosaurs on a Spaceship. And isn't that quite controversial for the way the Doctor finishes off?
Indeed.
Effectively executes Solomon. Is it Solomon? David Bradley's character? I can't remember the details, but I remember at the time.
But is this resolved then? If this is a thread, yes, it was. If this is a thread that's deliberate, does it go anywhere? Because the first time we had this at the end of Tennant's era, it was going somewhere. We thought the Doctor's getting a bit carried away, and then that turned out to be the point of the story. But I can't remember an equivalent here? Is it just individual writers putting those notes in because that's what they
It
want?
doesn't feel like it comes back in 7B at all.
I'm just thinking. I mean, because
It also didn't feel to me, and I did check myself when I was enjoying the moment. It doesn't feel like the Lonely God stuff of the Tennant era.
Have we had it made explicit that this is why the Doctor needs people to travel with? When is that first raised in the new series? That is it the Lonely God? Is that why? Do we have that same point made that you need to? This is why you have human companions to keep you human. Is
well,
that
Donna.
way back
I'm
then?
sure Donna says it very blatantly. I can't quite think when. First of Pompeii, actually.
Well, it could be, couldn't it? It's
I had a feeling she brings it up there.
Even I can remember that because it was only a month ago.
Yes, exactly.
But I don't think it's quite that explicit, so maybe it comes back later.
But I'm pretty sure it's the kind of thing she'd call. I have
Before
a
I
recollection
forget-
of her calling him out on it.
Why is there so little Amy and Rory? It's not like an Amy and Rory light story deliberately, is it? Or is it just slightly incompetent writing? Because they take them on locations. So it's not like they're trying to minimise their use of the actors.
They were filmed. I don't know about Lights, but they did film this and Asylum. They were doing a location work for Asylum with the Daleks at the same time, weren't they? Didn't they? They did both of them in Spain. So one would imagine it.
It's because Clint Eastwood rides into town by himself. He doesn't ride into town with a married couple. So the format doesn't fit. The format doesn't fit the pastiche or that they're trying to tell, does it? So they're struggling to give them things to do.
So if it hadn't been this mini-series, if it had been the same structure as the other Matt Smith series, this would have been an episode where James Corden turns up instead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can see him trying to give Amy stuff to do because they do that contrived bit of kidnapping in the sheriff's office, don't they? When Carla Jex loses his temper or feels threatened or whatnot, but it just feels very disposable, that bit. The money here is all about the Doctor and how he deals with the God-fearing local peasants and how he deals with the threat and so on. So they just don't fit in the type of story that they're trying to tell. I don't know whether that's incompetent or just a bad fit. I don't know.
It's difficult because if you had a bit longer to play with, then you could probably come up with a couple of subplots for sort of decent subplots for them. But yeah,
I think the arc, in terms of the ending, maybe I'll play devil's advocate and defend it. I think the arc of Carla Jax's character does work, but it's too fast. It's too sped up. Again, if it maybe had been twice as long, it would have made sense. All the beats are there. The fact that he mentions, I mean, as you say, because the pace at which this is told, the fact that he's said just how terrified he is of the afterlife, but then does away with himself anyway, might seem a bit rushed when there's only 10 minutes between those two, but it is actually set up for just what a big decision this is.
Yeah.
And quite how and how noble it is by his standards. So if you'd spread all that out a bit more.
Yeah.
So are we to think that Jex, the sort of war that he's escaping from, just happens to be 1868 in some other part of the galaxy?
You've made me think of Red Dwarf again. I was trying not to mention Red Dwarf.
Well,
but
no,
now
this
reminded me of my favourite
Yeah.
my favourite Red Dwarf